to the West and to Israel.
Okay, unlike yesterday's talk, which was, I tried to make it as academic and historical as possible. That is something which an historian is supposed to do. Today's talk deals basically with the current world and maybe some projections and so on. And so I would classify it as more political. And so I'm going to not speak freely, but speak more accurately from the paper. I hope it isn't completely boring. The major outcome of the wave of popular uprising known as the Arab Spring was the growth and ascendancy in the Middle East of militant authoritarian Islam, with all the dangers that this portends for the West, the region, and Israel. Today it is clear that the West is under a multi-pronged Islamic jihadist assault, and that the West refuses to acknowledge this. Denmark's Prime Minister, Helle Thorning-Schmidt, put it categorically immediately after a Muslim attack in Copenhagen a couple of years ago. The attacks had nothing to do with Islam. That was the phrase she used. It had nothing to do with Islam. Of course, this is absurd. The Muslim perpetrators of terrorist attacks in the West have consistently said they are acting in the name of Islam and according to the precepts of Islam. One might argue that their interpretation of Islam is mistaken and that other interpretations of what the Quran and the Hadiths demand of the believer say something different. But to flatly deny the link the perpetrators are making between the word and their deed is simply silly. President Obama, some months ago, chose a slightly different path, preferring evasion to denial. He defined the anti-Semitic attack on a kosher delicatessen in Paris as a random attack by unnamed zealots. The zealots randomly shot a bunch of folks, as he put it in Americanese. But it amounted to the same thing. Obama was exhibiting a refusal to acknowledge the truth of what was happening around the world, from the southern Philippines, through Kashmir and Pakistan and Nigeria and Kenya, to the Middle East and the streets of Europe. He was denying the nature and character of the enemy the West is facing. Needless to say, if you cannot identify your enemy, you cannot beat him. A sniper cannot hit a target if he fails to identify him. Obama is a thoughtful, calculating man. His pronouncement on the Delhi attack was not random. Since his speech in Cairo back in 2009, Obama has consistently declined to call a spade. Perhaps he hopes that the spade will somehow turn into a loving heart, or will simply go away. Or perhaps he believes that calling a spade will only aggravate the Muslim world's antagonism towards America and the West in general. Trump, his successor, seems to have less hesitancy about angering the Muslim world, but we still have to see where exactly he's going and what he actually thinks. The West and its agents in the Middle East are clearly under attack by Islam. Some would say by radical Islam. I believe this too is an evasion. The problem relates to the Islamic world as a whole, especially the Arab Muslim world, and to many, many Muslims who believe that their values and world are in conflict with the West. The number of Muslim attacks in the West has risen over the past year or two, though the number of perpetrators is very small compared to the vast demographic of the Muslim world. I would suggest that the number of attacks actually carried out is only a small fraction of the number conceived or planned, but frustrated by Western intelligence and security agencies. For every terrorist who knifes or shoots or bombs someone in the West, 10 or 20 or 30 would-be terrorists have been arrested or otherwise restrained. Moreover, it is well to remember that, as in most wars, only a very small proportion of any army actually sees combat. It is only the 10% or less at the spear point that actually kill and die. So it is in the current struggle of the Islamic world against the West. But the small minority that are engaged in jihad are backed wholeheartedly or substantively by roiling masses who pour out into the street, who demonstrate against blasphemous cartoons, or rage in support of toppling this or that twin power. See the massive sale of Bin Laden t-shirts in the streets of Kabul, Karachi, and Cairo. So it was with 9/11, so it is today. More or less universally, Muslims the world over, and especially in the Middle East, share a basic hatred of the West, stemming from a sense that its values are wrong, the West's values are wrong, and from a sense, rightly or wrongly, that the West has invaded their space politically, economically, and culturally, and sometimes militarily. Hence the widespread support in the Islamic world for anti-Western terrorist attacks and the almost complete absence of condemnation of such attacks by the Muslim world's spiritual leaders and intellectuals. The general tone has been for the past 20-odd years, yes, we understand why they did it. Occasionally, rarely, you will hear dissentient pronouncements by leading Muslims, such as Sheikh Ahmed al-Tayyib, the Grand Mufti of Al-Azhar University, the most prominent fount of religious authority in the Sunni Arab world. Some months ago, at a gathering in Mecca, Tayyib condemned Muslim extremists and said that they based their barbaric terrorist practices on a misreading of the Quran. Tayyib's statement should be viewed within the context of the new Egyptian regime's ongoing battle against the Muslim Brotherhood, ISIS, and Al-Qaeda terrorists in Egypt and in Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. True, Egyptian President Sisi recently called for a reform of Islamic education to counter the militant Islamist wave. But the sheer rarity of such pronouncements highlights the silence of the vast majority of Arab political and spiritual leaders in face of the extremists' terrorist outrages in the Middle East and the West. It is worth noting, incidentally, that dissentient pronouncements such as Tayyib's are almost always accompanied by telling qualifiers. Tayyib, in his speech in Mecca, for example, attributed the bloody upheavals in the Middle East to what he called the new global colonialism, presumably a veiled reference to American policy and actions, carried out, as he put it, in cooperation with Zionism. Did he mean that America and Zionism were responsible for the outbreaks of mass violence in Syria, Egypt, Libya, Iraq, and so on? Who knows? But Tayyib's point was to attribute the bloodshed and chaos to the West and to deny or diminish Arab agency. In any event, far more common are pronouncements by Muslim Arab spiritual leaders who straightforwardly support this or that variety of terrorism. The West and its wards and supporters in the Middle East are under a multi-pronged jihadist assault. The assault has occasionally reached the heartland of the West itself, London, Paris, New York, and Washington, D.C. The assault is largely unacknowledged in the West for what it is, partly because of the confusion caused by the fact that some of the assailants are at loggerheads among themselves. The jihad, which began in the 1970s or perhaps earlier, or perhaps in 1948 with the Pan-Arab assault on Israel, which was and is seen as a Western bridgehead, or even in 1915 with the Armenian genocide, in recent decades it has taken two forms, one explicit and clear, the other clandestine, long-term, and often subtle. The explicit jihad by Sunni organizations, such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS, is obvious and needs little explication or description. Sunni jihadists in the Middle East have attacked and continue to attack pro-Western regimes or groups seen as Western-linked, such as the Kurds, Yazidis, and Assyrians in northern Iraq, and have attacked Western targets in the Middle East and in the West itself, including many civilians. Far more subtle has been the long-term ongoing anti-Western jihad by Shiite organizations and states, primarily Iran and its agents. Indeed, most people in the West are simply unaware that these elements are engaged in jihad against the West. I'm talking about Iran and its agents. The founder and first leader of Islamist Iran, Ayatollah Khomeini, is quoted as saying, "Islam makes it incumbent on all adult Muslim males to prepare themselves for the conquest of other countries so that the writ of Islam is obeyed in every country in the world. Islam says, kill all the unbelievers. The sword is the key to paradise." That's the quote. Khomeini's explicit jihadist mindset is embedded in revolutionary Iran's constitution from 1979. In its preamble, it states bluntly that the function of the country's army and Revolutionary Guard Corps is not only to guard the state's frontiers, but also to fulfill, quote, the ideological mission of holy jihad that is extending the sovereignty of God's law throughout the world. That's what Iran's constitution says. It's simple and straightforward. Since the 1980s, Iran has implemented the jihadist policy on a number of levels. It has used proxy forces, and with great effectiveness. Sometimes its own units and operatives have engaged in jihad. In Lebanon in the 1980s, Iranian operatives and local Shiite proxies, chiefly from the Hezbollah, in a protracted, well-orchestrated campaign, drove out the Americans by blowing up American installations, the American embassy in Beirut twice, and killing hundreds of Americans. In Iraq in the early 2000s, Shiite militiamen backed by Iran and advised and armed by Iranian Revolutionary Guards regularly attacked the American forces that invaded the country to rid it of the Saddam Hussein regime. Lastly, Iran's links to al-Qaeda operations are unclear. It is known, for example, that before and after 9/11, Iran harbored key al-Qaeda operatives. Iran's connections to ISIS are also unclear. To be sure, Iranian Revolutionary Guards are busy today arming and training leading Shiite militiamen in their effort to push back ISIS in central and northern Iraq in order to protect the pro-Iranian Shiite regime in Baghdad. And they are fighting ISIS in Syria. But it is at least worth considering that Iran clandestinely has helped ISIS to grow, seeing it as a tool against the Americans in the West and the Middle East. The logic is clear. Anti-Western ISIS terrorism has deflected Western attention and energies away from Iran and its operations. Indeed, it has promoted a measure of tacit or clandestine US-Iranian cooperation in Iraq and Syria. This serves Iran well and certainly hampers Western efforts to rein in Iran, be it in terms of its efforts to take over through proxies various parts of the Middle East, or to constrain its nuclear program and ambitions. To be sure, Iran's jihadi campaigns, starting indeed from Khomeini's toppling of the pro-Western regime in Tehran in 1979, have focused on the near enemy, that is, pro-Western regimes and agents in the Middle East, rather than on the far enemy, that is, the heartlands of the West. Since the revolution, Iran and its proxies have assailed a variety of pro-Western regimes and outposts. They have periodically attacked Israel. Through Hezbollah, they have established dominance over Lebanon. They have triclopset to control of pro-Western regimes along the Persian Gulf. And most recently, Iran's agents, the Houthi rebels, have taken over much of Yemen, including the capital Sana'a, giving them the power to close the Bab el-Mandeb Straits at the entrance to the Red Sea. Today, Iran dominates Iraq, much of Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. To varying degrees, the Gulf states live in Tehran's shadow. When and if Iran succeeds in controlling or cowing the remaining pro-Western states in the Middle East, the Iranians may feel confident enough to engage in jihad outside the region. That, at least, is the logic of their ideology and policy. Let me add one more thing about Iran, which somehow seems to be true. Iran seems to be pushing for the creation of a Shiite crescent of power and demographically stretching basically from Iran through Iraq, through Syria to Lebanon. It's gradually reduced the Sunni population of Syria by basically pushing it out, and the millions of Syrian exiles, Sunnis that is, living today in Jordan, Turkey, and washing across Europe. The same probably applies in Iraq as well, that the proportion of Shiites to Sunnis has grown ever since Iran's essential takeover of the regime, or a partial takeover of the regime in Baghdad. So what we're seeing is a sort of a demographic reshaping of what used to be called the Fertile Crescent, which suits Iran's geopolitical aims in the region. The logic of Iran's nuclear project also, I think, is connected to the ultimate jihadi aims, and that is the aim of attaining nuclear weaponry and rocketry with which it can deliver nuclear weapons and cruise missiles that can range, that can reach Europe, Eastern Europe and Central Europe. This weaponry, once produced and perfected, will advance Iran's ambitions to dominate and overall the Middle East and push the West out of the region, and it will provide an umbrella for jihadi campaigning beyond the Middle East. Iran's policies, like the pronouncements of its leaders, are an unusual mix of Islamic messianism and pragmatism. For the time being, Iran's nuclear ambitions have been constrained, but this may not last, and within years, certainly within decades, Iran will likely attain nuclear weapons. The Ayatollahs and Revolutionary Guard generals who run Iran may then not unleash a nuclear war against Israel or other states, fearing that it could lead to their own destruction. But possession of the ultimate weaponry and the means of delivery will give it a far freer hand to utilize its proxies, including Muslim communities abroad, to destabilize pro-Western regimes in the Middle East and Western regimes beyond. Both ISIS and Iran strive to see the flag of Allah flying over the White House and the Houses of Parliament. We may believe such a vision far-fetched and unrealistic, but the mullahs in Tehran, like the preachers in Raqqa, think that with Allah's help, such an aim is realizable, indeed inevitable. We need to pay attention to their dreams.
Thank you, Benny. It was an insightful and provocative piece. Anybody have any questions or comments?
Well, we can close the session.
To the pod.
Benny, thank you very much. And I suppose that your thesis resonates quite well with the classical article of Hattington on Clash of Civilizations, and I think there was criticism on that thesis when it was printed, that if you look today, which is quite true, that most of the victims of Islamic terror are Muslims. And I wanted to ask, what's your position on the claim that the Clash of Civilizations does not really work when you see the results in the ground?
Well, no, I'm not sure that's I would interpret it differently. I would say that you're right. Most victims of Islamic terrorism are Muslims, but the Muslims who are busy killing those Muslims see them as heathens or infidels or dissidents who are engaged either through their religion or through their actions in pro-Western activities. In other words, they're helping the West to penetrate and to dominate the Middle East and beyond. That's how the Islamic radicals see the Muslim so-called moderates or unparticipating Muslims in this struggle. They're traitors, and so they deserve death, and even if they don't, they're not traitors, in any case they're going to go to heaven as shaheeds, so it's not it's actually okay that they're dying. At least in their religious beliefs. I think I think Huntington was right. I think he saw that the Clash of Civilizations was unfolding, and I think that perception, that is how it is seen by what I actually said. That's how it's seen by Muslims. That's how the world is seen by Muslims, most Muslims today. There is a clash of civilizations. Some of them are willing to take it farther and go on jihad within that clash. Most are not willing to take part in it. Some actually may even deny that there is a clash of civilizations. But I think the majority do feel that there is a clash between their world and the West in terms of values and on the ground in various ways.
So to follow up on this issue, so how do you see Western engagement with Iran and with the radicals, Sunni radicals and Shiite radicals? Because here you have the Obama administration giving $150 billion worth of deals and cash to the regime. The regime, when it was about, it seemed to be under a lot of pressure. Sanctions was working, the economy was really beginning to go very low in Iran, and the administration sort of props it up at the last minute with a lot of contracts, bringing the regime back into the political family of nations as a legitimate business partner. Now we see like Siemens, Boeing, and other major corporations doing major business with Iran. And then and this current administration doing a deal, a lot of it was already done under the Obama administration, but Trump's administration implemented it eagerly. They give a deal of $350 billion to the Saudis. So it's $500 billion that we know of. What are funding the extreme Islamists in the Sunni and Shiite world is an odd way to me of engaging. And the previous administration also supported the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt running up to the elections, and was very helpful to them. And the Cairo speech, if you can talk on the Cairo speech, that was Obama's first sort of foreign affairs speech, where he invites the Muslim Brotherhood as honored guests of the speech in Egypt. So what was this engagement, and what are these deals? And it seems to me we should be isolating and fighting this reactionary movement.
Well, the deals firstly aren't money given to countries. The deals are selling things to countries which pay for them, and you make money out of it, and you get jobs in America as a result. So
they also got a lot of cash in this deal with Iran. There's a lot of cash. In addition to...
There was also freeing some cash, which I don't think it was 150 billion, but anyhow, there was freeing of cash which had been frozen over the years as a sanction, right? But I think ultimately we're talking about deals in which Iran buys things which it wasn't able to buy before and pays for them. So, and certainly under Trump, I think money talks. That is, money is probably the most important thing he thinks about. And so he's willing to sell the Saudis billions of dollars worth of weapons, or hundreds of billions. Nobody actually knows whether all these deals are going to go through, incidentally, but there was talk of that, sure. But ultimately, you're right, the deals help the Iranians overcome their economic problems and empower the regime. They give it the extra funds it needs to wage wars in Yemen, or subversion in Libya, or test and build rocketry, which will eventually be able to deliver nuclear weapons. And this is a problem. Obama believed, I don't think that Trump believes that, but Obama seems to have believed that dialogue was the way to reach the hearts and minds of Muslims who had grievances against the West, some of which were real and many of which were not real. But that was the way to reach their hearts and minds, and perhaps persuade them to become nicer human beings or better members of the international community, positive members of them. And I don't think since his speech in 2009, dialogue has helped that much, but on the other hand, or efforts at dialogue have helped much, but on the other hand, there's been so much military activity alongside talk about making dialogue, that it's not clear that the Muslims perceive what Obama was doing as an effort at dialogue rather than an effort at deceit alongside actual military operations, killing bin Laden and all sorts of special forces and other types of operations and contributions to operations by proxies, American proxies, and support for Israel, of course. So the path of dialogue, a pure path of dialogue, was never actually engaged in by America for various reasons. And I think the Muslim Arab world still largely thinks of America as an enemy, of the West as the enemy. The relations with Iran, American-Iranian relations, and the American steps are controversial. The outcome is unclear. We can't really judge them at the moment. We have to wait 20, 30 years to see what is going to be the result of the American-Iranian nuclear deal. If it turns out that in 20, 30 years the Iranians actually will have produced atomic weapons, and maybe even engaged in these years when they're not supposed to have, in clandestine development of the nuclear project, then it will turn out to have been a very bad mistake on the West's part. On the other hand, if the Iranians do not produce in 10, 20 or 30 years' time nuclear weapons, it will be rated as a success historically, maybe. Obama's. But we're in the moment, so we can't really judge its historical effects.
So just as a footnote, 2 weeks ago in Germany, some people were arrested trying to get into the pieces for the nuclear weapons program to Iran. And I attended a pugwash meeting in Israel on nuclear proliferation with a focus on Iran. And there's, I'd say, a lot of concern.
Look, a country as vast as Iran can engage in clandestine development towards reaching a bomb without actually testing the nuclear weapon and without perhaps the West knowing that it's doing this. It's such a large place and they're very clever. They can be doing this, and I imagine that this is what they are doing. That's my guess, if I had to guess.
Thank you so much for the lecture. And regarding the Iranian connection, so the Sunni Axis or alliance, I mean Saudi Arabia and United Emirates, Jordan and Egypt, sometimes they include Israel in this alliance, they believe that they have two enemies. They have ISIS, meaning radical Salafiyya Jihadiyya, it's not only ISIS of course, and they have Iran. Hence the claim that Iran might be helping ISIS. But the map shows us something a little bit different. It shows us that, it's not that I'm contradicting what you have just said, I'm just trying to add to it and then let's talk. The map shows us that Iran is actually trying to divide the Middle East into two parts. The Shiite proxies, Hezbollah and not only, I'm talking about the Iranian militias that you have mentioned, they are helping Syrian leader Assad, and they are helping also to bring more Shiites inside Syria and Lebanon. Meaning they are also turning to Druze, okay? So, and reminding them that they are deriving from the Shiite religion as well. We have evidence of that. When I say we, I mean all kinds of business intelligences and agencies. We have evidence of that from 2015. Meaning 2 years of work, with boots on the ground in the field in Syria and Lebanon, when Shiite clerics are coming with already Shiite missionaries alongside the Shiite soldiers and commanders, such as Soleimani. And the thing is that this is the Iranian connection, meaning they are trying to conquer as much territory as possible in the north of the Middle East, while Saudi Arabia is trying to balance it from the south. So the great clash of civilization, I'm just going to connect it. The great clash of civilization has already happened. It happened, I believe, in the 20th century. Now we're even beyond that. We're talking now about a local conflict that might help somehow, I'm going to explain why, resolve the world conflict that we're talking about. When we speak about the civilization of Islam on one side and the civilization of the West on the other side. We're talking about a war between Shiites and Sunnis, which is already occurring. We don't know what's going to happen next. It all depends on too many factors. And with America being in the middle of it, and with Russia being in the middle of it, everything right now depends on what happens in Syria. So we're just hanging on that little piece of land and trying to understand what's going to happen next. What do you think?
Well, you're right. There has developed over the past decades a conflict between Shiite and Sunni Islam. And in some way that is part of the conflict of civilization, if you like, in a way that the Sunnis are in some way lined up with the West, or proxies, or supporters, or beneficiaries of the West, whereas the Shiites are turning out to be the spear point of the Islamic assault on the West. That's essentially how it's working, by attacking the West's proxies in the Middle East. That's the connection between the two, if you look at it like on large. That's the connection between the Sunni-Shiite clash and the global clash of civilizations between Islam and the West. That's how it's turning out. And at the moment, it does look like the Iranians are doing well. The Iranians are doing well. And as I say, this is translated into demographics in the northern areas of the Middle East, apart from Turkey, which are turning more and more Shiite, when Shiism was always a very small minority in the Arab world.
Yes,
That
okay.
was first, and then sorry.
what do you see as the main grievances that Muslims have against the West?
Repeat that.
My question is that what do you identify as the main grievances that the Muslim world has against the West?
But the main grievance is that the West, the Westerners, do not recognize Allah and His Messenger as the true word, as the true word of God. This is the real word. All the rest is false. Christianity is a false revelation. Judaism is a false revelation. Maybe it was tentatively okay at the time, many hundreds of years ago, but today the only acceptable revelation is Muhammad's and Allah. And this is the real grievance, that is that they have rejected the word of God, they reject the word, they reject God. This was clear in the 7th century when the Jewish and pagan tribes, or certainly the Jewish tribes in Hijaz, rejected Muhammad and his preachings at the time, which resulted in Muhammad essentially killing or forcibly converting or expelling the Jewish tribes from Hijaz. That's when it begins. I think that's the major grievance, that they do not accept the word of God as laid down by Islam, that Islam is the only true religion. It could be that the Christians early on in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, 4th century, even maybe in the Middle Ages under the Crusaders, believed that theirs was the true religion and all the rest were infidels or wrong. Today, that past in Christianity has accepted that there are other religions, they're all legitimate, etc. This Judaism has done also over many centuries. The Muslims don't accept that. The Muslims basically think that they have the divine word and it's theirs exclusively, and the rest are wrong.
But there's also
So that's the major grievance. That's the major grievance. Apart from that, there is Western encroachment, military, cultural, economic, etc., on the Muslim world. Domination of the Muslim world for centuries, certainly for the past, not centuries, decades, certainly since World War I, by the West at the time, which was Britain and France. In the Middle East, I'm talking about Britain and India, Pakistan, and so on. That's seen as somebody else pushing their cultural agenda and their economic and political and strategic interests at the expense of the locals who are Muslims. And that's been going on in their view, in the Muslim view, certainly for at least 100 years, maybe actually longer in certain parts of the world, the Indian subcontinent. And this is seen as wrong. In other words, the clash of civilizations on that point is seen by many Muslims as defensive, not offensive jihad. It's defensive jihad. It's defending our lands against these infidels who are encroaching on us militarily, politically, and so on. What other grievances? Well, Islam has certain precepts, have gone down the centuries from the Quran through the Hadiths and so on, about how you're supposed to behave socially. Women's dress codes, sexual conduct, and so on, things which have greatly offended, and all you have to read Said Qutb's works and so on. These are very offensive to Muslim sensibilities, people who believe in what the Quran and its interpreters say about how people are supposed to behave. Most famous case, as I remember, Said Qutb describing how in Oklahoma or somewhere he went to a dance hall and the women were all semi-dressed or lewd or something, and this was like a key thing in his view of the West. This was the West in his view. So that's also something. It's a grievance in their view. In today's Guardian, anybody see today's Guardian? The newspaper, the Guardian, if you're aware of it. It's a leading English liberal left newspaper. There's an article about a lady, a Saudi lady who walks into an area in the Najd, some holy site not a holy site, but a historical site in the Najd. She's walking around dressed like a tourist, a Muslim lady, probably doing it provocatively, without headdress, midriff bare or whatever, and this they find very, very difficult to take. And this is what the West exports into their domains. That's how they see it. There are probably other grievances which I haven't mentioned. I'm sure there's economic exploitation, which there was. I mean, they took out Saudi oil, you know, it was giving the locals 1 or 2 or 3% of the take for decades until the 70s. So there was economic exploitation of various sorts. And I'm sure one can find 1,000 other grievances of this order. But I think I've mentioned the key ones.
So Rita.
Yes, thank you for your interesting lecture. I have a question regarding the Iran. Despite of all the differences between Sunni and Shia, Iranian and other Iranian politicians, for instance, emphasizes the necessity to be to unite against Israel of the Muslims. Only because of the weakness of the Muslims, Israel could exist. Do you think that the emphasis of this unity is only rhetoric or a real political strategy with any prospect of success? Especially in the view of what is said about the real political situation in the Middle East.
Well, as to the future, one never knows, but what you're saying is true. The Muslim world never properly united against Israel, and this is the reason for Israel's success in '48, if you like, for the Zionist movement's ability to grow even under Ottoman Turkish rule until 1917, and beyond under the British, who were pressured by the Muslims to stop this but didn't. And then 1948 war, and then since the Muslim world has never unified properly and hasn't brought its power, its potential power to bear, as I emphasized when I talked about '48, which is one of the reasons for Israel's success. I have no doubt that the Muslim world is and this is a point of unity in the Muslim world, despite factions, you know, Sunnis, Shiites, etc. The one thing they can agree on, and that's why I don't anticipate any real development in the Israeli Gulf state alliance against the Iranians, you know, the Saudis and the UAE and so on will join Israel in an alliance because they have this common enemy. I think people are wrong on that. The Saudis will never, as far as I can understand the Saudi mentality, they're not going to make peace with Israel. They're not going to accept Israel's existence. But they may accept tentatively and, you know, temporarily benefiting from this mutual antagonism towards Iran in various ways. But this is the one point Shiites and Sunnis agree on, that Israel should not exist. It should be wiped off the map if possible. You asked about the future, whether they can ever unite to do that. I don't know. I don't know if that's today it's a bit, the problem of nuclear weaponry raises the whole matter to a different level. In other words, it raises it to a level that if they do manage to unite and want to destroy Israel, they will have to bear the costs of a nuclear war, which might destroy them as well as Israel. So I'm not sure that they're that keen on doing that. Though there may be Messianic Muslims who think that that's a price worth paying, or that Allah will prevent Israel using its nuclear weapons in retaliation and destroy them. So this is all incalculable, it's all in the future. But at the moment, because of the nuclear factor that Israel does have nuclear weapons, destroying Israel isn't that simple. It can be done through nuclear weapons, as I say, at mutual cost, which may not be. But it also can maybe be done through attrition, with Palestinians gradually overwhelming Israel in terms of numbers, getting the West to turn around and turn anti-Israel, and there'll be a total boycott, as there was, say, against South Africa. Maybe they think this course of attrition might eventually lead to Israel's disruption or downfall. Those are the two paths to the destruction of Israel, the two possible paths. One being through Palestinian and world support for the Palestinians in overwhelming Israel, if you like, from within, or nuclear weapons from without.
So in light of this question, do you see, sort of given the civil war and the genocide in Syria, and that's sort of maybe people are arguing, Lizzie will argue next week that Syria and Iraq don't even exist anymore. We have to redraw the maps. So given for generations the sort of European anti-Semitic, Nazi-inspired, Christian-inspired anti-Semitism that the regimes have been feeding their population for years and years, it's always look at Israel, don't look at us, Israel's the problem. And now that the regimes are turning on their own citizens, there is I hear, there's sort of the grumblings of maybe Syrians, Iraqis, and people in the Middle East realizing that Israel's not the great evil, but that they've been fed a diet of propaganda, and that Israel's actually not a horrible country, and people are beginning to kind of, I don't know, there's the percolation of maybe an opposition to the regime that's less antagonistic to Israel.
Look, I'm a pessimist. I think one should interview these Syrian refugees flooding the West, Greece, Italy, going north, and ask them what they think of Israel. They'll say they hate the Assad regime, they hate the Shiites, or they hate the Sunnis, whoever they hate at this given moment because of their particular trials and tribulations. But I think that you will hear from the guys who've come out of there, they also hate Israel. And some of them also say Israel in some ways responsible for what's been happening in Syria, Iraq, in some, incalculable way, but that's what they will say. I think the hatred of Israel is a constant. So long as the population is brought up on this diet of hatred of Israel, as the Egyptian media and education system still does, despite 40 years or whatever it is of peace with Israel, this is what they're taught. This is what the children, what's the name, had it very, what's her name, Ayhan Hirsi.
Ayhan Hirsi.
Yeah. Say it again.
Ayhan Hirsi.
Ayhan Hirsi Ali, right. She, in her autobiography, there's a telling passage. It's called Infidel, if I'm not mistaken, in her autobiography. And she was brought up in wherever it was, Somalia, but eventually she also spent some years in Saudi Arabia as a child. And she has a telling passage there about sitting outside as a Somali girl, listening to Saudi women hanging out the laundry there. That's the thing I remember there. And she says they were all speaking against the Jews. They were saying the Jews are evil and they're responsible for this and they're responsible for that. And the Saudi women, of course, had never seen a Jew. There aren't any Jews in Saudi Arabia. They're not allowed to live there. They're not allowed to visit, not allowed to live there, of course. And she came away from that basically with the belief that this is how Muslims are brought up. In Saudi Arabia, certainly, but probably in much of the Muslim Arab world.
Also in South Asia.
Maybe in South Asia as well. I know a little about the Middle East. They're brought up thinking this from the age of 0, that the Jews are responsible for whatever ills are befalling them. The Jews control London, they control New York, they control Moscow, and everything that happens, even if it happens at the hands of somebody else, is really behind that are the Jews. It's all obviously completely ridiculous, but that's how they're brought up. So if they are antagonistic at this moment or suffering at the hands of the Assad regime or some other character in the Middle East, they have also their own internal hatreds, but there is a constant there. And the constant is hatred of the Jews. If the education system in the Arab world changes and suddenly they start producing a neutral or even beneficial image of the Jew, things could change. It's to do with education. But so long as this is the staple diet of schools throughout the Arab Muslim world, this is how they will relate to us. So it doesn't matter whether today we're in some way aligned with them, or at least on the same side against Iran.
So this is a good business to be in.
Can I interject?
What's a good business to be in?
Anti-Semitism.
Your business, yes, you've gotten onto a good thing.
I was intrigued by Narvis's question concerning the grievance. Because sometimes we flippantly say that the way to sin is to simplify the complex and complex the simple. And I was wondering, was your question rhetorical when you raised the question, what's the greatest grievance? You didn't say greatest, but I have a tendency to think that this whole theological piece may be simplifying the complex. I know you kind of gave us a litany of the other grievances, but we sort of start there. Should we be starting there if we're looking for an end game? If it's really that complex? I'm recalling Femi's lecture yesterday about measuring. I mean, this is very complex, but yet we always start there? Is there a particular reason why we're starting there?
Do we have to look for an end game? Some things are just reality. What you want as an end game, maybe not realistic. Shouldn't we be looking always for the solution and how the world can be bettered and so on? When, I mean, it's obviously good to look at how the world should be bettered, but look at the reality first. That's more important than your wishful thinking.
I wouldn't call it wishful thinking.
I just did.
You characterized it, but I wouldn't say that's what it is. But, back to my brother's question, was it rhetorical or were you satisfied with his answer?
No, I was satisfied with his answer, because I can testify to this. I have
So
conducted.
you wanted him to affirm what you already thought?
Yes. Exactly how it is. His response to my question wasn't surprising.
Most people do that. Most people do that. Yeah.
Yes, they do, and that is not healthy.
I don't know about that. I'm sure you do as well. You do as well.
But go ahead, let him finish, because. I want to ask you a question.
Wait, let him finish.
Okay.
Well, I have conducted a series of interviews with Muslims in my hometown, Lucknow, when I was doing a case study of Lucknow to understand anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in the larger region of South Asia. And I interviewed clerics, journalists, literatures, students, politicians, and this did come up in the conversations time and again, that a final peace would come only when the whole world embraces Islam. That would be the only time when we would have absolute eternal peace.
And that will put him out of the job, you know that.
Comment? I would raise a question about in word religion. I think we have to complexify the word religion, and I would complexify it by simplifying and saying that in my own life experience, even within Judaism, I was raised very Orthodox. That I think that there are two. You can have two classes of religions. One class of religion is a totalizing religion, and fundamentalist Orthodox Judaism is like that. I imagine there are branches of Christianity like that, although I'm not even sure that exists within Christianity. And that is that the religion is not about your spiritual life, but is actually a science of the entire world. It tells you the reality of the entire world. It tells you why the sun rises. It tells you why the sun sets. It tells you what life and death is, what birth is. These are totalizing religions, which tells you the entire reality of all your experience is explained throughout the religion. I think other religions, including, for example, within Judaism, modern Orthodoxy to conservatives and things like that, are really focused on will not challenge science, will not challenge, and it's not just about science per se. It's about whether or not the religion is the only lens through which you can see the world, or a lens through which you can see the world. So I suspect in the West, when we talk about religion, we think of religion as here is your spiritual lens, but not your totalizing lens, right? Whereas I think that fundamental forms of Islam, these are totalizing lenses, and I think that might be the difference.
I think that's going to vary, even within denominations, and of course within individuals. I mean, we certainly can complicate the conversation about religion a great deal. One of the things to consider is whether individuals or groups see it as holistic. Like this is like, and say for instance, I can use one example, the Pentecostal component of the continuum in the Christian faith. And even then, there's a great deal of variation. But one has a sense there that it defines everything. It defines every aspect of one's life. But I think that is not in itself necessarily unusual. It just expresses itself differently. Because it seems to me you're really just talking about cosmology. And it's just like my whole, how do I integrate or shape myself within the world?
Single sentence, I think I was simply bringing in that point to sort of respond to your point about whether religion should be number one in the list of grievances, and I was simply making an argument that if you see it as totalizing, I think it's easier to understand why it would be grievance number one.
I affirm what you're saying. My only pushback would be, I just think it's, to get to the root and cause of this, I think it's, at the heart of it is self-interest. That what is assisting me, these groups of people, on that day-to-day, moment-to-moment decisions, even if you want to call it this totalizing religion, I still believe that it is, like we were talking about, what feeds my family, what, and so these sort of extra, these other grievances that you added, they impact the self-interest of these individuals, versus sort of what I would say this large theological Word of God interpretation. When you begin to talk about the masses. Now, the propaganda may start with the Word of God, theological pushes, but at the heart of it, it's got to get back down to the self-interest of individuals and how they make their decisions. That's how you really get the masses behind something.
So
I don't even think they're bright enough to really grasp the top theological issue.
So I want to sort of go back to yesterday with Femi's brilliant lecture, and we sort of ended, last night upon reflection. I think Femi, I don't want to mischaracterize, so Femi's hand is up next, and he'll get to speak. But I think there was a sort of, from Femi's perspective, this need to enter into a dialogue as something very important. And I invoked Emmanuel Levinas's words that you cannot dialogue with people who think a group of people are subhuman. Once you reach that level, dialogue and recognition becomes impossible. Because once you reach that level, subjugation, slavery, and genocide is a logical outcome of an ideology that dehumanizes groups of people. And there's no dialogue with that, in my view. What's also interesting, and I think that's also important, people with an intimate knowledge and understanding of the Middle East, Jews and other minorities of the Middle East, have been up against and have been studying and learning and understanding and living with this narrative in their daily lives. And they and we understand it. And I think that narrative needs to be heard. And I would say, as Femi says, we often look to the West and from the West to understand reality. And as Femi argues eloquently and vitally, it's very important that we understand and look to Africa, look to other parts of the world, Asia, to learn the wisdoms that exist in the world and people's experiences and narratives. But I would urge you that the narrative of the Israelis has been so demonized that the Israelis and other people in the region have an experience and an understanding and a knowledge, and I would even go as far as saying a wisdom of what is taking place in the world. And we, involved in ISGAP, and people for much longer than ISGAP and myself, have been warning civilization, been warning the West, and been warning the world that once this reactionary social movement consists of A, B, C, D, and E, and once it's unleashed, all hell's going to break loose. And pathetically and tragically, we've been only coming here for 3 years. We started off worrying about Iran, and 3 years later, we're talking about 600,000 dead people in Syria as this reactionary ideology is marching forward. And it goes back to the question, yes, it's very important to understand why, and I think globalization, and there's all sorts of issues where we can try to understand why it's happening and what it's happening, and at the same time, we were speaking after the session yesterday from a Jewish philosophical worldview, which is one worldview of many, life is sacred, and God gives life, and I have an obligation to protect life. That's my teachings, that's my wisdom. And we have to protect life, and we in this global system are not doing a very good job. And we have to figure out, understand the problem and try to find ways to act to stop it. Professor Doctor.
I don't even know where to begin, except just simply to make a couple of very general observations. I suppose, in a way, one of the things I find intriguing about the Torah is that there are so many different layers of conversations going on. And I personally find there's a variety of layers of conversation. And sometimes when we have these conversations, we conflate these layers. We become tediously reductionist in that analysis. And sometimes unintentionally to damage. That's just simply my view. On the subject of dialogue, as you rightly mentioned, just a point of clarification. I am not naive about dialogue at all, or reconciliation or accommodation, and I just want to clarify what I suggested regarding dialogue and reconciliation. I think one can engage in dialogue and reconciliation and also face human reality in terms of geopolitical conditions as they're configured. So that's just really, and I think as we engage questions of dialogue and reconciliation, we have to be realistic about who we're talking to and who we're not talking to, and the ways in which we're talking to. So I just wanted to clarify that point. In so many ways, I'm with you, but there are certain individuals or groups that you just simply can't dialogue with. And I think it's really very important for us to make that very clear. On the subject of anti-Semitism, which I think is important to, I would imagine, all of us, if not most of us in this room, there's no question whatsoever this is the most fundamental, in my view, most essential element of hatred that has just been so persistent and virulent. It takes on different dimensions. I think it's really very important for us all to recognize that we're being conditioned and socialized, not culturated one way or another, in subliminal ways to internalize some of these insidious ideals. And they do speak to a particular kind of anti-Israel, anti-Zionist view that so many people around the world are raising. I think it's really important to put that at the center of the table and recognize that. But it's also very important for us to understand the complexities of these issues. On the question of religion, I'm just going to have to really say one or two things very quickly. We need to be very careful about that characterization of the role of religion in these times. Because, I mean, quite frankly, we're not scholars of the subject. And to make categorical statements on subjects on which we know very little, in my view, is intellectually dangerous. So I'm not saying we shouldn't engage these issues. We should, but we need to engage them with elements of caution and some element of reflection. Religions that are fundamentalist, and they do come, by the way, in so many great world religions. I think what is significantly different in the case of Islam, and I'm generalizing a bit here, is really the question in which major strands of Islam has not come to terms with modernity. So I think it's really very important for us to appreciate that this is not intrinsic in any way, shape, or form to Islam. It's not. The issue of fundamentalism and the dangers of fundamentalism is something we've seen in so many different contexts, in so many world religions, including Christianity, and particularly Christianity and Muslim. And we need to really think about this context. And I'll give you just one very basic example, and it's a very serious example. Atlantic slavery is very much rooted in ideologies that came out, quite frankly, out of
out of Christianity, very clearly, and dominated much of the Atlantic world for several centuries. Atlantic slavery was legitimated by my own religion. And I am a Christian. And I need to recognize that. And it was, quite frankly, totalizing for 2 centuries, to be sure, across the Atlantic world. It was legitimated. And there are passages that were lifted uncritically out of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament to clearly sanction and legitimate that what is clearly, I'm sure all of us will agree, was a catastrophe of enormous proportion. So we can pick and choose. And we need to be very, so in a way, I think that element of, I don't even, when I mentioned earlier that I didn't quite know where to start, I want us to, and I want us to really sort of engage this conversation to recognize the centerpiece of the subject and also to acknowledge the various dimensions of what it is we're talking about in different historical contexts and its implications to the degree that we're talking about humanity, to the degree that we now come to appreciate what humanity are we really talking about and in what context is this humanity really that important to us. So I'll just, it's more statement, more than a question, but I just want to mention that, particularly in light of the fact that you mentioned quite graciously, Charles, my talk and our discussion yesterday, and also Pastor Darrell. So I just want to throw that there, not as a subject that I feel we need to in any way worry about or think about, but just simply things that I'm thinking at this particular moment.
So Jason, and as you speak, I keep coming back to Akiva's lecture on Sunday. It's very powerful.
So, thank you for making these comments. But I think it's very important to make very clear, we're not labeling Islam as a whole as a terrorist religion over here, but there's a clear element within Islam, radical Islam, okay? You mentioned humanity, but they do not see a group of people as human and will take all extreme measures in order to attack, target, infiltrate, in order to make whatever their vision a reality.
But that's not unique to Islam.
We never said, but
absolutely.
But that's not the point of the discussion, though.
That is not unique to Islam in modernity. That is my point. I'm in agreement with you that there's a particular strand of Islam which does evoke this kind of behavior, but it depends very much on where you stand. And I just gave you the example of Atlantic slavery, for example. I am a Christian, 4 generations. I cannot ignore that fact that Christianity legitimated Atlantic slavery. It did. I mean, that is not to suggest that all Christians did or most Christians did. So we're really not in, the fundamental question here is not so much an argument. I see the point you're making, and I think it's a legitimate point. It's a point to be taken very seriously. But I think as we approach this issue, we also need to be mindful of context.
So I'm going to evoke the chair's role. So Jason, please finish your point, then Benny. Let's say quite what you made. So Benny had a point?
I just had a small point to make on slavery. Many more black Africans were enslaved by Muslims from North Africa and the Ottoman Empire than blacks were enslaved by Westerners on the Atlantic
But you're
states.
just making my point.
I'm not making
You're
your
making
point.
my point.
No, I'm not making your point. I'm making another point. You're not making a contrary point. You singled out Western slavery. I'm talking about Muslim slavery of blacks, which went on into the 20th century. It wasn't ended in the 19th century. It went on in Saudi Arabia and in the Ottoman Empire well into the 20th century. So that's a point also worth mentioning when talking about slavery and banging on the drum of slavery. That's one of my points.
Let me just mention
let me finish. You had a long time. Let me just two more sentences, okay? On the subject of the Old Testament and slavery, you're right. You can cull sentences in the Old Testament supportive of having slavery, but you also have the point of manumission, which Christianity adopted from the Old Testament when abolitionists, for example, spoke against it. The idea of manumission. Slavery was general in the old world 2,000 and 3,000 years ago. The Bible was unusual, the Old Testament, in allowing for the freeing of slaves. That's my point. I just wanted to make that.
Yeah, and can I just very quick comment that there's actually no argument here. That's really what is quite in so many ways, in my mind, to be perfectly honest with you, limiting about this conversation. Because what I'm interested in is not so much as giving cherry-picking examples, but really encouraging us to take context very seriously. I totally agree. I'm a student of the field. I know quite a bit about the transatlantic slave trade. I agree with that evidence, and I agree with that particular case study. I gave a particular example in a particular context, and there are so many other contexts that one can provide. So this is not in any way an argument in defense of any particular religion. That is not the point. But really what I'm suggesting is that we need to be mindful. As you rightly mentioned, the transatlantic slave trade was horrific, and it lasted a long time. So, but that's another context, and it's a very important context to think about. But that does not in any way mean we cannot talk and think about Atlantic slavery as another historical context.
Thanks for your lecture, first of all, I would say. Our colleagues emphasize some questions, historical questions. But my questions, in the past, the Muslims Muslims diabolized and defamating Jewish people. But do you think that how you evaluate in the origin of all problems there is the biggest question that Islam is it compatible with liberalism and respect to one another? And do you think that it's the moment to go out of the Dima concept and Muslim doesn't ignore minorities and different colors of communities, for example. But there is the biggest question to answer. Muslims and Islam, is it compatible with liberalism to respect one another, minorities? And it's a big question. If we find the solution and response, I think we could find the answers of the two persons who discussed. Thanks.
Well, I'm afraid that I do believe that there's an incompatibility between Islam and liberalism. This is proven in all the Arab states, all the Arab Muslim states. There's an intolerance in the Arab world of the other, the Arab Muslim world of the other, and lack of respect for the other. It's basic in Islam, and it stems from that first thing I talked about, that the other doesn't accept the right God. He doesn't look to the right God, he doesn't respect the right God, therefore he can't be tolerated and he can't be respected. And that's what it stems from. And that's the problem in Islam, not radical Islam, that's the problem in Islam in my view. I may be wrong about that, I'm not an expert theologian, as the man pointed out, I'm not an expert on religions, but that's how I see things.
But in Western values, it requires really to adapt in this condition of living together.
Yes, modern Western values are liberal and tolerant, and this is unacceptable in Islam. Islamic communities in the West living under the jurisdiction and influence of Western liberal societies at least pay lip service to ideas of tolerance and respect for the other. They don't do that in Muslim majority countries.
I want to follow up on that, if you may. I know you were born in Azerbaijan, right?
Yeah.
I was born in Bashkortostan, which is a republic inside Russian Federation, and which is also Muslim. In certain circumstances, Said and I, we both know it is possible for Islam to be absolutely compatible with not only other religions, but with more liberal values such as the ones that were raised on in the Soviet Union, for instance. I know that sometimes in the West, people regard the Soviet Union as this very unliberal, let's say, creation, but in many ways, they were much more liberal in the 70s and 80s and before than many other countries, and especially in terms of Islam. The Muslims of the Russian Federation right now are much more compatible with their, let's say, surroundings than the Muslims in the West. And in fact, I know that many Western governments are learning right now how to implement the same very successful methods of cooperation that have already been in the Russian Federation and the Russian government for years. So there is a way, only we need to find it.
I talked about Muslim majority countries and places where they're in the minority. That was a major point I made.
Muslim majority countries like Azerbaijan.
Well, under the Soviet Union, you're right, the Muslims were a small minority.
Now it's not the Soviet
Yeah, now it's different.
But excuse me, I look at something that when we say, for example, liberal values or coexistence, we have to, and liberal values requires to respect to all others, not only in faith. In our country, we have some problems. For example, sexual minorities has some problems. Obligation to leave Russia or Azerbaijan too, because we cannot fully and fair liberal values didn't adapt and it doesn't function until Western democracy model or liberal values, and that's why we have to accept that coexisting and inclusive societies is different than when we compare our model with Western model, and that's why I don't accept that in our country or in Russia there are fully liberal values towards all minorities. I agree with your opinion that for Islamic, for Muslims in your country there is no discrimination, for example, in public policy, for example. But in the different issues of liberal values, there are the problem. Absolutely, we have to accept that, and we have to focus for results.
Then I'm sorry, I have a little bit of follow-up. To answer to that, do you think that the problem is because this is a Muslim country, or because this is a non-liberal country in any other way, such as
I think in the origin of the problem there is the Islam and the Sharia laws who requires inners of different colors of community, of faith, and Dima concept comes from the Quran. You know, and it shows that Muslims cannot live together with different, for example, who and doesn't accept Muhammad, for example.
How would you then explain the total tolerance and even part of a culture of accepting gay people in the Ottoman Empire, for instance, which was absolutely Islam?
I think some interpretation from Quran and for Mullah explains that we have to respect all person, for example, all race, all sexual orientation of all different questions, but in practice, in the philosophy and ideology of Muslims, it's not absolutely acceptable, and we have to focus on the reality and the facts we have to emphasize, I think.
So we need very specific circumstances in order to raise war.
I try to be...
Very briefly, I think there is a strong element of intolerance inherent in all Abrahamic religions. Even, I'm not a student of theology, but this is how it comes across in the narratives. And it is illustrated by a story that is common to all three religious traditions as to how Abraham is the first monotheist who desecrated all the idols that his father had in his shop, leaving just one intact. And when his father comes and asks as to who broke the idols, he said it was, he points towards the idol that was still intact. So there seems to be a kind of subtle approval to imposing one's faith, one's belief on others. what becomes worse in the case of Islam is the lack of central authority. It is for this reason we cannot expect from the Muslim world a declaration on the lines of Nostra Aetate that we obtained from the Catholic Church. So, in spite of this, I do believe that there is no substitute for dialogue. How else can we check the spread of hatred, even if we cannot completely eliminate or exterminate hatred, if we do not indulge in dialogue? It is only through dialogue that we can check the spread of hatred and violence.
But who are you dialoguing with?
Yes, I admit that this certainly is a problem because there is no central authority. So maybe we can have dialogue with multiple centers, unlike what has been the case with the Catholic Church.
Right, I promise, very short. At the end of yesterday's talk, I half jokingly, I ran up to Femi and Charles, who were talking about this kind of position of like dialogue and such, and said, well, the dialogue always continues. It just may not always be verbal. It might be a bomb. But I'm quite serious too. That's why it's a half joke. That the engagement, you said this long, silence. One of the things I learned when I came here as an American who was very loud and very expressive and quite transparent with my emotions, I learned at Oxford the power of silence. So you say something and someone didn't agree, say, right. And that was very different. And so I had to incorporate that into my lexicon. But so my point is, there are different kinds of dialogue.
Michael.
I'm sorry if I'm not aiming to politics now, but I think that we touch crucial points regarding psychology of human being. What was the population of the world in times of the Prophet? Anybody knows? I don't know it. It's a question for you.
What was the world population?
That's impossible to estimate.
Okay, it's impossible to estimate, but
Google
in
it.
seven.
Which prophet?
Okay, in
Muhammad.
Muhammad.
Because there were other prophets, you know.
I know. I think that the one in play now is.
No, all biblical prophets are revered by Muslims.
Let me give you an example. In 1700, the population of France, I will focus, was only 300,000 people. So I don't think that we were more at the time of the Prophet Muhammad. From Egypt were about 3 million Jews that left. 600,000 were between 20 and 60 years of age when Moses liberated them, right?
I don't know where you have your figures from.
Can you just make your point, Michael?
They're not in the documents,
We're
let's put it that
running
way.
out of time. What's your point?
No, so I continue in another time. I need 5 minutes to.
We're at the end of this session, so Benny, thank you, and I think an evocative issue, obviously, and thank you for the dialogue. I would, just on a sort of a final note, I think the Noahide laws and the Kiva speech is very important at a profound level. I think some of us here have been engaging, and I urge other people to engage in the study of political Islam, because the study of political Islam is concrete and it's serious. It began in Egypt 100 years ago. Know the ideology. Those of us who study political Islam are not insulting Muslims or Islam. The greatest perpetrator of mass murder on Muslims is political Islam. And they're aiming in their rhetoric and in their ideology for Jews. They're focusing on Jews while they're killing their own fellow co-religionists. So this is an issue that is confronting more and more people, and there's people at the table. I came to this issue late because at Oxford, at McGill, at the University of London in political science and philosophy, there was not a course on political Islam. It was off the table. They were taking money to build buildings here from the Muslim Brotherhood, but nobody explained the ideology of Mr. Qutb and Banai and Sheikh Kawadari, who was on the board of trustees, who calls on all believers to continue the work of Hitler. There's nothing ambiguous about that. That's a core element of its ideology. If people are coming to kill Jews, and as Elie Wiesel said, that anti-Semitism begins with Jews, and tragically and pathetically, once again we can see it does not end with Jews. And this is something that we have to grapple with and understand and deal with in our reality, and this problem is expanding amazingly rapidly. How do we cope with this? So thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Yeah.